Everyone thinks Vikings were badass warriors who sailed around conquering everything with their epic beards and horned helmets. But what actually happened when you joined a Viking raid would make modern extreme sports look like a relaxing spa day. In fact, most Vikings didn't even survive their first major expedition, and the reasons why have nothing to do with glorious battle deaths. You'd wake up one morning thinking you're about to become a legendary warrior, and by sunset you'd be begging to go back to whatever boring life you left behind, assuming you were still alive to beg. Hello, before you settle in, I'd truly appreciate it if you take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with what I'm sharing here. It means so much to me. Also, please share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always touched to see how we're all coming together from across the globe. Now let's create a calm space, lower the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for a gentle hum, and let's begin this journey together. Let's start with the moment you decide to become a Viking. It's the 9th century Scandinavia, and you're probably a farmer whose crops have failed for the 3rd year running. Your family is staring at a winter that might kill them all, and some smooth-talking jarl shows up promising riches beyond imagination if you just hop on a boat and sail to England. Easy money, right? Just grab an axe, scream a lot, and come home rich. Here's your first reality check. You don't own an axe, or a sword, or any weapon worth mentioning. That rusty farming sickle you've been using to cut grain, that's not going to intimidate anyone, especially not the professional soldiers you'll be facing. Real Viking weapons cost more than most people made in several years. A decent sword was worth the same as about 8 milk cows. Unless you're already wealthy, you're going to war with whatever pointy stick you can fashion from scrap metal. But wait, it gets worse. Even if you somehow scrape together enough silver to buy proper gear, you still need to get selected for a raid. This isn't a volunteer army where anyone can show up. Viking expeditions were carefully planned business ventures, and the leaders weren't looking for enthusiastic amateurs. They wanted experienced fighters who could pull their weight in battle and wouldn't panic at the first sign of blood. Your farming background might make you strong, but it doesn't make you a warrior. Let's say you somehow impress a raid leader enough to get picked. Congratulations, you're now part of a crew heading to England to get rich. The first thing you discover is that Viking longships, those sleek vessels that look so majestic in movies, are basically floating torture devices designed by someone who clearly hated human comfort. Picture this. You're crammed into a boat with 30 to 60 other unwashed men, all of you packed together like sardines in a can that smells like fish, sweat, and human waste. There are no bathrooms on a longship. When nature calls, you either hang your butt over the side of the boat while it's moving through choppy seas, or you use a bucket that everyone shares. The smell becomes part of your identity after the first week. The seating arrangement consists of wooden benches with no back support, and you'll be sitting on these for weeks at a time. Your job is to row when the wind isn't favourable, which is most of the time, because Viking ships were designed for river travel and coastal raids, not comfortable ocean cruising. Your hands will develop blisters, then calluses, then more blisters on top of the calluses. The constant rowing motion will leave your back screaming in pain, and there's nowhere to lie down properly. Speaking of lying down, sleep on a longship is a joke. You get to curl up on those same wooden benches or on the bottom of the boat, which is always damp and often has a few inches of cold seawater sloshing around. Your fellow Vikings snore, fart, and occasionally vomit on you. The boat rocks constantly, so even when you're exhausted enough to ignore the discomfort, the motion keeps you awake, and the food, you're eating dried fish, hardtack that's basically edible rocks, and whatever fermented dairy products haven't gone completely rancid yet. Fresh water is rationed because storage space is limited, so you're perpetually thirsty. Some crews bring ale, but that's usually reserved for the leaders. The regular raiders get water that tastes like the inside of a wooden barrel and has things floating in it that you try not to think about. But here's where things get really interesting. All of this suffering is just the journey to the raid. You haven't even started the actual Viking part yet, and already you're wondering if this was a terrible mistake. Most modern people would quit after the first night on the ship. The smell alone would send them swimming back to shore. Now you might be thinking that surely the promise of riches makes all this worthwhile. Here's the thing about Viking raids that nobody tells you. Most of them were complete failures. For every successful raid that made it into the history books, there were dozens that ended in disaster, death, or empty-handed crews limping home with nothing to show for their suffering. The targets weren't sitting around waiting to be pillaged. By the time Vikings became a serious threat, the English, Irish, and French had developed pretty effective defence systems. Those monasteries full of gold that seem like easy targets. They were often protected by armed guards, fortified walls, and warning systems that could summon help from nearby settlements. Even when raids were successful, the division of loot was heavily weighted toward the leaders. The Jarl who organised the expedition takes the biggest share. The experienced warriors who actually know how to fight get the next biggest shares. You, the desperate farmer with the rusty sickle, get whatever scraps are left over, if anything. After months of suffering, you might come home with enough silver to buy a decent meal, assuming you come home at all. Let's walk through what happens when you finally reach your destination. You're approaching the English coast, and your captain has spotted a promising target. A small coastal village with a church that probably has some valuable religious items. The plan is simple. Land the boats, overwhelm the locals with superior numbers and ferocity, grab everything valuable, and get back to the ships before reinforcements arrive. This is where your complete lack of combat experience becomes a serious problem. Viking warfare wasn't the chaotic berserker frenzy that popular culture depicts. It was organised, tactical, and required split-second decision-making that kept you alive. Real Viking warriors trained from childhood. They knew how to fight as a unit, how to read the battlefield, and how to kill efficiently without getting killed themselves. You, on the other hand, have never been in a real fight in your life. The closest you've come to violence is chasing foxes away from your chicken coop. When the first arrow flies past your head, your body floods with adrenaline and terror in ways you've never experienced. Your hands shake so badly you can barely hold your weapon. Your vision narrows to a tunnel. You forget every piece of advice the other raiders gave you about staying alive. The English villagers aren't helpless sheep waiting for slaughter. Even the farmers have weapons and know how to use them. They're fighting for their homes, their families, and their lives. That desperation makes them dangerous in ways that your greed simply can't match. While you're trying to figure out which end of your spear to hold, some English peasant who's been using farm tools as weapons his whole life is coming at you with a scythe that could take your head clean off. But wait, it gets worse. Let's say you somehow survive the initial assault without getting yourself killed through sheer incompetence. Now you have to actually participate in the raiding process, and this is where most people's romantic notions about Viking life completely fall apart. Real Viking raids weren't glorious battles between honourable warriors. They were brutal, efficient exercises in terrorism designed to extract maximum wealth with minimum resistance. You're not fighting enemy soldiers in fair combat, you're attacking civilians. Farmers, craftsmen, priests, women, children, elderly people who can't fight back. This is the reality of what made Viking raids so profitable. They targeted the defenseless. Your job is to help terrorize an entire community into submission, to take everything they own, and to make examples of anyone who resists. This isn't noble warrior culture. This is organized crime on a massive scale, and you're now part of it. The psychological impact of participating in this kind of violence destroys people. Many raiders developed what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD, drinking themselves to death or becoming completely unable to function in normal society. And that's assuming the raid goes according to plan. Most raids didn't. Intelligence about targets was often wrong or outdated. That monastery you're attacking might have been abandoned years ago. That wealthy merchant town might be hosting a garrison of professional soldiers. That easy target might be a trap set by locals who are tired of being raided. When raids went wrong, they went spectacularly wrong. Viking longships were fast, but they weren't invincible. If local defenders managed to damage or destroy your boats, you were stranded in enemy territory with no way home. English coastal communities developed techniques for fighting Viking raiders that turned the raiders' advantages against them. One common tactic was to let the Vikings land and start their attack, then cut off their retreat to the ships. Suddenly, instead of being the hunters, you're the hunted. You're trapped on unfamiliar ground, outnumbered by people who know the terrain, with no supplies beyond what you carried with you. Most stranded raiders died of starvation, disease, or were slowly hunted down by local militias. Here's something that really changes everything. Successful Viking warriors weren't the savage berserkers of legend. They were careful, calculating professionals who avoided unnecessary risks. The raiders who survived long enough to become wealthy did so by picking their battles carefully, working with reliable crews and knowing when to retreat. The image of Vikings as reckless warriors charging into hopeless battles is mostly fiction. Real Vikings were basically ancient pirates, and pirates succeeded through cunning. not courage. This creates a horrible catch-22 for inexperienced raiders like yourself. To survive and profit from Viking raids, you need experience and skill. But to gain that experience, you have to survive raids where your inexperience makes you a liability. Most wannabe Vikings solved this problem by dying on their first or second expedition. The mortality rate for new raiders was absolutely brutal. Disease killed more Vikings than combat did. Living in those cramped, unsanitary conditions on longships was a perfect breeding ground for dysentery, scurvy, and various infections. Many raids ended not because of military defeat, but because half the crew was too sick to fight. Let's talk about what happens when you get wounded during a raid, because this is where the romanticized version of Viking life really falls apart. There are no battlefield medics on a Viking expedition. There are no hospitals to retreat to. Your medical care consists of whatever folk remedies your shipmates might know, most of which are completely useless. A minor wound that would be inconvenient in modern times becomes life-threatening when you're stuck on a boat for weeks with no way to keep it clean. Infection sets in, and you're facing amputation, or death with no anesthetic beyond whatever alcohol the crew might share with you. Many raiders who survived the actual fighting died slowly from infected wounds on the journey home. Even if you somehow managed to avoid injury, disease and death, you still have to deal with the psychological aftermath of what you've done. Viking society didn't have concepts of war crimes or post-traumatic stress, but the effects were the same. Raiders who participated in particularly brutal attacks often couldn't readjust to normal life. They became alcoholics, outcasts, or took increasingly dangerous risks on subsequent raids until their luck ran out. Now, you might be wondering about the famous Viking warrior culture that supposedly made all this worthwhile. The reality is that most Vikings weren't warriors at all. They were farmers, traders, craftsmen, and fishermen who occasionally went on raids when they needed extra income, or when their regular livelihoods failed. The professional warrior class was tiny, and they didn't welcome outsiders. The whole dying gloriously and battle guarantees entry to Valhalla thing was basically propaganda, designed to make desperate people willing to risk their lives for other people's profit. Most Vikings who died on raids didn't die gloriously in battle. They died of dysentery on ships, or from infected wounds, or were killed while running away from fights they couldn't win. There's nothing glorious about dying alone and forgotten on some foreign beach, because you made a series of terrible life choices. But here's where most people would give up, but you're still somehow committed to this Viking lifestyle. Let's say you beat the odds and actually survive your first few raids with some modest profits. Congratulations, you're now addicted to one of the most dangerous and unreliable income sources in human history. Viking raiding was like gambling, but with much worse odds and much higher stakes. A successful raid might net you enough silver to live comfortably for a year. An unsuccessful one might cost you your life, your health, or your sanity. The psychological pressure of constantly betting everything on increasingly dangerous ventures destroyed many raiders who were initially successful. The smart Vikings used their raiding profits to invest in legitimate businesses, farming, trading, or crafts. The stupid ones kept going on raids until their luck ran out. Guess which category most people fall into when they're chasing the adrenaline high of easy money and violent adventure? And that's assuming you're even welcome on future raids. Viking expeditions were tight-knit groups that relied on trust and competence. If you proved yourself to be unreliable, cowardly, or just plain unlucky, word would spread throughout the Viking community. Nobody wants to sail with someone who brings bad luck or can't be counted on in a fight. This creates another vicious cycle. As opportunities for raiding dry up, desperate Vikings often turn to increasingly risky ventures. Longer voyages to more distant targets, attacks on better defended positions, or partnerships with less reputable crews. The desperation makes them sloppy, the sloppiness makes them unsuccessful, and the lack of success makes them more desperate. Let's examine the economic reality of Viking raiding, because this is where the fantasy really crumbles. Most historical sources about Viking wealth come from the most successful raids, the ones that were remarkable enough to be recorded. This creates a massive survivorship bias that makes raiding look much more profitable than it actually was. For every raid that brought back enough treasure to make the participants wealthy, there were dozens that barely broke even after accounting for equipment costs, food, boat maintenance, and compensation for injured crew members. Many raids actually lost money when you factored in all the expenses and risks involved. The Vikings who became genuinely wealthy didn't do it through raiding alone. They used raiding as one part of a diversified economic strategy that included trading, farming, crafts, and political manipulation. The pure raiders, the ones who depended entirely on pillaging for their income, usually ended up poor, disabled, or dead within a few years. Here's something that will make sense of everything. The golden age of Viking raiding lasted less than a century. By the time everyone thinks of as the Viking era, most Scandinavians had already moved on to more profitable and less dangerous activities. The Vikings who continued raiding were mostly the desperate, the addicted, and the ones who couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. As target communities developed better defences and established more effective military responses, Viking raiding became less and less profitable. The easy targets were gone, the survivors were prepared, and the political landscape was changing in ways that made large-scale raiding expeditions practically impossible. The final nail in the coffin was the conversion of Scandinavian rulers to Christianity. This wasn't just a religious change. It was a political and economic realignment that made raiding a liability rather than an asset. Christian kings couldn't openly support piracy against other Christian nations without facing severe diplomatic consequences. But even before the official end of the Viking Age, smart Scandinavians were already transitioning to legitimate businesses. The skills that made someone a successful raider, navigation, organization, risk assessment, and cross-cultural communication, were equally valuable in legitimate trade. Many former Vikings became merchants, explorers, or military contractors for established kingdoms. This transition reveals something important about Viking culture that most people miss. The whole warrior society thing was mostly a marketing campaign designed to attract recruits for what was essentially organized crime. The real Viking culture was pragmatic, adaptable, and focused on whatever economic opportunities were available. When raiding became unprofitable, Vikings didn't stick to their warrior traditions out of stubborn pride. They pivoted to farming, trading, crafts, and politics with the same efficiency they'd once applied to pillaging. The ones who couldn't adapt to these changes were left behind, along with their romantic notions about glorious warrior death. So what does this mean for you? The hypothetical modern person who thought becoming a Viking sounded like an adventure? You would have been one of the ones left behind. Your romantic notions about warrior culture would have made you exactly the kind of naive recruit that experienced Vikings exploited for profit. You would have paid premium prices for substandard equipment, accepted terrible terms for your share of any loot, and been used as cannon fodder in the most dangerous parts of any operation. If you somehow survived long enough to figure out how the system really worked, you'd discover that the successful Vikings were basically running a pyramid scheme with weapons. The tragedy is that many people who joined Viking expeditions were genuinely desperate. They weren't looking for adventure or glory. They were trying to feed their families or escape impossible situations at home. The Viking leaders exploited this desperation, promising wealth and glory while delivering mostly death and suffering. Modern people who romanticize Viking culture are usually thinking about the winners, not the thousands of forgotten losers who died miserably in service of other people's ambitions. For every famous Viking warrior whose story survived in the sagas, there were hundreds of anonymous farmers, craftsmen, and desperate young men whose bones are scattered across the beaches of medieval Europe. This is the part that changes everything about how we think about Viking culture. It wasn't a society of equals where everyone had a chance to become a legendary warrior. It was a hierarchical system where a small elite used propaganda about honor and glory to recruit disposable soldiers for their profit-making ventures. The famous Viking values, courage, honor, loyalty, and the rest, were real enough, but they were applied selectively. The elite Vikings honored these values in their relationships with each other. The disposable recruits were expected to demonstrate these values through self-sacrifice, with no expectation of reciprocity. Sound familiar? This is the same pattern that shows up in every society that relies on convincing young people to risk their lives for other people's benefit. The language changes, but the underlying structure remains the same. A small group of decision-makers profits from the risks taken by a large group of expendable followers. If you were transported back to Viking Age Scandinavia tomorrow, you wouldn't become a legendary warrior. You'd become a statistic in someone else's success story, assuming you were lucky enough to become even that. Most likely you'd die anonymously and be forgotten completely. Just another modern person who discovered that historical reality doesn't match historical romance. The skills that make someone successful in modern life. Critical thinking, long-term planning, risk assessment, and the ability to recognize and avoid exploitation would actually work against you in Viking society. These traits would make you question the propaganda, avoid the obviously dangerous situations, and seek out legitimate alternatives to raiding. But questioning the system would mark you as unreliable, avoiding danger would mark you as cowardly, and seeking alternatives would mark you as unambitious. In a culture that valued conformity to group decisions and unquestioning loyalty to leaders, your modern sensibilities would make you an outcast. This creates a bitter irony. The psychological traits that would most help you survive Viking-age Scandinavia would also prevent you from becoming a Viking in the first place. You'd end up as a farmer, craftsman, or trader. Basically living the same kind of life you'd live in any other pre-modern society, just with worse weather and fewer opportunities. The weather, by the way, was genuinely awful. Medieval Scandinavia was colder than modern Scandinavia, with shorter growing seasons and longer winters. The Little Ice Age was beginning to affect Northern Europe, making agriculture increasingly difficult and contributing to the desperation that drove many Vikings to seek their fortunes elsewhere. This climate change, yes, medieval people dealt with climate change too, meant that even successful raids often weren't enough to make up for failing harvests and increasing food scarcity. Many Viking expeditions were essentially desperate attempts to avoid starvation, not ambitious schemes to accumulate wealth. The environmental pressures that drove Viking expansion also limited its sustainability. As the climate continued to cool, the agricultural surpluses that had originally funded raiding expeditions began to disappear. Communities that had once been able to spare young men for seasonal raids found themselves needing every available worker just to produce enough food to survive. This environmental factor explains why Viking raids became increasingly desperate and poorly planned over time. The early Vikings had the luxury of careful planning and selective targeting. Later, Vikings were forced to take whatever opportunities they could find, often attacking targets that any rational risk assessment would have ruled out. You, as a modern person, suddenly thrust into this situation, would be arriving at the worst possible time. The golden age of Viking raiding was already over, but the cultural mythology around it was still strong. You'd be joining a movement that was essentially in its death throes, but nobody would admit it because admitting failure would undermine the entire social structure. This kind of situation, where everyone knows the system isn't working anymore, but nobody wants to be the first to acknowledge it, creates a particularly toxic environment. People become increasingly desperate, increasingly willing to take irrational risks, and increasingly hostile to anyone who suggests that maybe the traditional approaches aren't working anymore. As a modern person with modern sensibilities, you'd be exactly the kind of outsider that desperate communities blame for their problems. Your questions about the wisdom of raiding increasingly dangerous targets would be seen as defeatism. Your suggestions about alternative economic strategies would be seen as betrayal of traditional values. Even if you somehow managed to avoid dying on a raid, you'd face the challenge of surviving in a community that was simultaneously convinced of its own superiority and terrified of its own obsolescence. This psychological combination creates some of the most dangerous social environments in human history. The final phase of any declining warrior culture is always the most violent, because the traditional outlets for violence are no longer providing the expected rewards. When external raiding becomes too dangerous or unprofitable, the violence turns inward. Communities that once directed their aggression toward outsiders begin to tear themselves apart. This is exactly what happened to Viking society. As raiding opportunities dried up, many Scandinavian communities descended into civil wars, blood feuds, and increasingly elaborate revenge cycles. The same warrior skills that had once been channeled toward external targets were now being used to settle domestic disputes. You, as someone with no established place in these traditional networks of loyalty and obligation, would be particularly vulnerable during this transition period. In a stable society, being an outsider is merely inconvenient. In a collapsing warrior culture, being an outsider is potentially fatal. The social skills that make someone successful in modern society, building broad networks of casual relationships, maintaining professional distance, and avoiding deep personal commitments, are exactly the wrong skills for surviving in an honor-based culture where everything depends on intensely personal relationships and absolute loyalty. Modern people are trained to be adaptable, to change jobs and communities as opportunities arise, and to prioritize individual success over group loyalty. These traits, which are assets in modern life, would mark you as untrustworthy and potentially dangerous in Viking society. The Vikings who survived the collapse of raiding culture were the ones who could successfully transition their loyalty networks into new economic and political structures. They became the founders of medieval kingdoms, the leaders of trading companies, and the architects of the political systems that replaced the decentralized raiding culture. But this transition required exactly the kinds of deep social connections and generational relationships that you, as a modern person, would never have time to develop. By the time you figured out how the system really worked, the window of opportunity for joining the new elite would have already closed. So you'd end up in the same place as most Vikings who couldn't make the transition, marginalized, impoverished, and increasingly desperate as the world changed around you in ways you couldn't control or understand. The only difference is that your marginalization would happen much faster, because you'd start from a position of complete social isolation. This brings us back to the original question. Would you survive as a Viking? The answer isn't just no, it's that you wouldn't even get the opportunity to fail in interesting ways. You'd be eliminated from consideration before you ever got the chance to prove how unsuited you were for the lifestyle. The Vikings who recruited people for raids weren't looking for eager volunteers. They were looking for people who already had the skills, connections, and resources to contribute to successful expeditions. Desperate farmers got recruited because they could at least row boats and follow simple orders. Desperate modern people would offer nothing that Viking leaders wanted. Your modern education, with its emphasis on critical thinking and individual decision-making, would actually be a liability in a culture that valued unquestioning obedience to traditional authorities. Your modern work experience, with its focus on specialized skills and professional relationships, would be irrelevant in a culture that valued generalized toughness and personal loyalty. Even your modern physical fitness would probably work against you. Most modern people, even athletes, are adapted for different kinds of physical challenges than medieval Scandinavians faced. You might be able to run a marathon, but could you row a boat for 12 hours straight in rough seas while seasick and dehydrated? Could you march 20 miles in homemade leather boots while carrying 40 pounds of equipment? The physical demands of Viking life weren't just about strength or endurance. They were about adapting to specific environmental challenges that modern people never encounter. The constant dampness, the irregular food supply, the exposure to weather, and the lack of medical care created a baseline of physical stress that would overwhelm most modern people before they even got to the dangerous parts. And that's still just the beginning. We haven't even talked about the diseases that were common in medieval Scandinavia, the nutritional deficiencies that affected everyone, or the constant pain from injuries that never healed properly. Modern people live in a world where minor discomforts are quickly addressed with effective treatments. Vikings lived in a world where major suffering was just part of everyday life. The psychological adaptation required to function in that environment would fundamentally change who you are as a person. The modern concept of individual rights, personal autonomy, and emotional well-being would have to be completely abandoned. You'd have to accept that your life had no inherent value beyond what you could contribute to group survival. This isn't just a matter of adjusting your expectations. It's about rewiring your basic assumptions about what life should be like. Most modern people would find this psychological transition more difficult than any physical challenge, because it would require abandoning the fundamental beliefs that make modern life meaningful. The Vikings who thrived in that environment weren't just physically tougher than modern people. They had completely different concepts of selfhood, purpose, and meaning. They found satisfaction in things that would horrify modern people, and they accepted hardships that would drive modern people to despair. This psychological difference is probably the biggest barrier to modern people succeeding in historical environments. It's not just that the physical conditions were harsh, it's that the mental frameworks that made those conditions bearable are completely alien to modern thinking. Modern people are trained to expect that their lives will generally improve over time, that their efforts will be rewarded with increasing comfort and security, and that they have some control over their circumstances. Vikings lived in a world where life was generally brutal, where effort was rarely rewarded, and where most circumstances were completely beyond individual control. The psychological resilience required to maintain hope and motivation in that environment is something that most modern people never develop. We're adapted for environments where persistence and hard work usually pay off. Vikings were adapted for environments where persistence and hard work were just the minimum required to avoid immediate death. This creates a fundamental mismatch between modern expectations and historical realities. You wouldn't just be facing physical challenges that your body wasn't prepared for, you'd be facing existential challenges that your mind wasn't prepared for. The combination would be overwhelming in ways that are difficult for modern people to even imagine. But let's say you somehow managed to overcome all of these obstacles and actually became a successful Viking raider. What then? You'd discover that success in Viking culture brought its own set of problems that were just as difficult as the challenges of failure. Successful Vikings were expected to be generous to their followers, hospitable to their guests, and protective of their dependents. This meant that most of your wealth would immediately go to supporting other people, not improving your own circumstances. The social obligations that came with success were often more burdensome than the hardships of failure. Wealthy Vikings also became targets for other ambitious Vikings who wanted to improve their own status. Success made you powerful, but it also made you vulnerable in new ways. You'd have to constantly defend your position against rivals, protect your family from enemies, and navigate increasingly complex political relationships. The stress of maintaining high status in a warrior culture was enormous. One mistake, one moment of weakness, one bad decision could destroy everything you'd worked for and leave you worse off than when you started. Many successful Vikings cracked under this pressure and made the kinds of errors that ended their careers and often their lives. This is another aspect of Viking life that modern people completely underestimate. The popular image of Vikings as free-spirited adventurers ignores the intense social pressure and constant anxiety that came with participating in warrior culture. The freedom to seek wealth and glory came at the cost of ever being able to truly relax or feel secure. Modern people are used to environments where success brings security. Viking success brought responsibility, danger, and the constant fear of losing everything. Most modern people would find this trade-off unacceptable, even if they could somehow achieve the success in the first place. The psychological profile of people who thrived in Viking culture, high tolerance for uncertainty, comfort with violence, ability to make life or death decisions quickly, and willingness to sacrifice everything for social status, is almost the opposite of what makes people successful in modern society. Modern success requires careful planning, risk management, collaborative problem solving, and the ability to build sustainable systems. Viking success required rapid improvisation, risk-taking, competitive dominance, and the ability to exploit temporary opportunities. These are fundamentally different skill sets that require different personalities and different values. Even if you could somehow develop the skills needed for Viking success, you'd have to abandon most of the values and personality traits that make you successful in modern life. By the time you became a competent Viking, you'd no longer be recognizably the same person who started the journey. This transformation wouldn't just affect your external behavior, it would change your internal experience of being alive. The things that bring you satisfaction, the relationships that give your life meaning, the goals that motivate your actions. All of these would have to change in fundamental ways. Most modern people, faced with this choice, would choose to remain unsuccessful rather than undergo such a complete personality transformation. The psychological cost of becoming a successful Viking would be higher than the material benefits it provided. And that's the final irony of the Viking fantasy. The people who are most attracted to the idea of becoming Vikings are usually the people who are least capable of actually making the psychological changes required. The independence, individualism, and personal freedom that make Viking life seem appealing are exactly the traits that would prevent someone from succeeding in Viking society. Real Vikings weren't free spirits seeking adventure. They were products of a specific cultural system that shaped their values, behaviors, and goals in ways that are completely incompatible with modern thinking. The Viking life that appeals to modern people never actually existed. It's a fantasy created by combining the most appealing aspects of Viking culture while ignoring everything that made that culture possible. So when you imagine yourself as a Viking, you're not really imagining yourself in Viking society. You're imagining yourself in a modern fantasy that borrows some superficial elements from Viking history. The real experience of being a Viking would be so different from this fantasy that most people wouldn't recognize it as the same thing. This is why historical fantasies are so appealing and so dangerous. They let us imagine ourselves in exotic circumstances without forcing us to confront the reality of what those circumstances would actually entail. We get to feel adventurous and bold without actually risking anything or changing anything about ourselves. But history isn't a costume party where you can try on different identities without consequences. Historical realities were produced by specific conditions that can't be separated from their context. You can't be a Viking without living in Viking society, and you can't live in Viking society without becoming a fundamentally different person than you are now. The modern world, for all its problems, offers opportunities for personal growth, creative expression, and meaningful relationships that were completely unavailable to most people throughout human history. The trade-offs we've made, comfort for adventure, security for freedom, complexity for simplicity, have generally been worth making. This doesn't mean that modern life is perfect, or that we can't learn anything from historical cultures, but it does mean that the grass isn't necessarily greener in other historical periods, especially when we take an honest look at what life was actually like for most people in those periods. The appeal of Viking culture reflects some genuine problems with modern life. The lack of clear purpose, the absence of physical challenges, the difficulty of forming deep social connections, and the feeling that individual actions don't matter in the face of huge institutional forces. But the solution to these problems isn't to fantasize about living in historical periods when these problems were solved at the cost of creating much worse problems. The solution is to find ways to address these modern challenges without abandoning the benefits of modern life. You can seek physical challenges without risking death from preventable diseases. You can build deep social connections without accepting the rigid hierarchies that historically enforced them. You can find meaningful purpose without participating in violence against innocent people. You can make your individual actions matter without abandoning the safety nets that protect you when things go wrong. The real lesson of Viking history isn't that modern people are soft or that historical people were tougher. It's that human societies always involve trade-offs, and the grass is rarely as green on the other side as it appears from a distance. The challenges faced by people in different historical periods were different, not necessarily easier or more satisfying. Understanding this doesn't make history less interesting, it makes it more relevant. Instead of using historical fantasies to escape from modern problems, we can use historical knowledge to better understand the choices available to us and the consequences of different approaches to organizing human society. The Vikings, for all their faults, were people trying to solve the same basic human problems that we still face. How to provide security for their families, how to find meaning in their lives, how to build communities that support human flourishing, and how to adapt to changing circumstances beyond their control. Their solutions don't work in our context, just as our solutions wouldn't work in theirs. But understanding how they approach these challenges can help us think more creatively about our own options and more realistically about the costs and benefits of different choices. That's the real value of historical knowledge, not as a source of fantasies about alternative lives, but as a resource for thinking more deeply about the life you actually have and the choices you actually face. The Vikings wouldn't have survived a day in modern society, and you wouldn't have survived a day as a Viking. But both societies represent human attempts to create meaning and security in an uncertain world, and both have something to teach us about the possibilities and limitations of human social organization. So the next time you find yourself romanticizing Viking culture, remember that the real Vikings were just people trying to make the best of difficult circumstances with the resources available to them. They made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but often led to consequences they never intended or expected. The most successful Vikings weren't the ones who most perfectly embodied the warrior ideal. They were the ones who recognized when that ideal was becoming obsolete and adapted accordingly. They transitioned from raiding to trading, from fighting to farming, from seeking glory to building sustainable communities. This adaptability, rather than warrior prowess, is probably the most admirable trait of Viking culture. When their traditional way of life stopped working, they didn't cling to it out of stubborn pride. They evolved, changed, and found new ways to thrive in changing circumstances. But that evolution required abandoning many of the romantic elements that make Viking culture appealing to modern people. The successful post-Viking Scandinavians became merchants, diplomats, and administrators. Basically the same kinds of people who run modern society. They traded adventure for stability, glory for prosperity, and individual heroics for collective success. Now, you might be wondering what all this means for your own life. The fantasy of becoming a Viking usually reflects some dissatisfaction with modern circumstances. Boring jobs, meaningless routines, comfortable but unfulfilling lives. The Viking fantasy offers an escape into a world where individual actions have immediate, dramatic consequences, and where life has a clear, simple purpose. But here's what really changes everything about how we think about meaning and purpose in life. The things that made Viking life feel meaningful were also the things that made it brutal, short, and often pointless. You can't separate the dramatic consequences from the constant suffering, or the clear purpose from the limited options. Modern life offers something that Viking society never could: the opportunity to create your own meaning and purpose instead of having them imposed by survival necessities. The freedom that modern people complain about, the overwhelming number of choices, the lack of clear direction, the responsibility for defining your own goals, is actually an incredible luxury that most humans throughout history never experienced. Vikings didn't choose to be Vikings because they found raiding spiritually fulfilling. They became raiders because the alternatives were starvation, slavery, or death. Their clear purpose was imposed by circumstances beyond their control, not chosen based on personal values or interests. The modern anxiety about finding purpose and meaning reflects the fact that we actually have the luxury of choosing. This choice is overwhelming and sometimes paralyzing, but it's also an opportunity that represents one of the greatest achievements of human civilization. Instead of fantasizing about times when purpose was imposed by necessity, we can appreciate the freedom to create purpose through choice. Instead of romanticizing societies where individual actions had dramatic consequences because survival was always at stake, we can find ways to make our actions meaningful within systems that provide basic security. The real challenge of modern life isn't that it lacks the drama and clear purpose of historical periods, it's that it offers so many possibilities for drama and purpose that choosing among them becomes a significant challenge in itself. This is a much better problem to have than the problems faced by most people throughout history, even if it doesn't always feel that way. This perspective doesn't solve the modern problems of meaninglessness, isolation, and lack of clear direction, but it does suggest that the solutions lie in making better use of modern opportunities, rather than fantasizing about escaping to historical alternatives that were never as appealing as they seem from a distance. You can create adventure in your life without risking death from preventable diseases. You can build meaningful relationships without accepting the social restrictions that historically enforced them. You can find purpose in your actions without limiting yourself to the narrow range of options available to people in survival-focused societies. The key is recognizing that modern freedom comes with modern responsibilities. When your survival isn't dictated by immediate circumstances, you have to take active responsibility for creating the kind of life you want to live. This is harder than following traditional scripts, but it's also more rewarding when done well. Vikings didn't have to worry about finding their passion, or creating work-life balance, or building fulfilling relationships. Their choices were made for them by the harsh realities of medieval Scandinavian life. This simplified decision-making, but it also eliminated most possibilities for personal growth, creative expression, and authentic self-discovery. The modern struggle to create meaning and purpose reflects the fact that we have genuine options. The anxiety that comes with choice is the price of freedom, and it's a price worth paying when we understand what we're getting in return. So what would happen if you actually tried to live like a Viking in the modern world? You'd quickly discover that the elements of Viking life that seem most appealing, the adventure, the clear hierarchy, the simple goals, don't actually work when separated from the survival pressures that created them. Modern Viking lifestyle movements typically focus on the superficial aspects, the aesthetics, the mythology, the romanticized values, but they can't recreate the underlying conditions that made those elements functional in their original context. The result is usually a kind of historical cosplay that misses the point of what made Viking culture work for the people who actually lived it. Real Vikings would probably find modern Viking enthusiasts completely incomprehensible. The idea of choosing to live like a Viking, when you could choose to live comfortably and safely, would seem like obvious mental illness to people who became Vikings only because they had no better alternatives. This doesn't mean that there's nothing to learn from Viking culture, or that all historical interests are pointless fantasy. But it does mean that the lessons worth learning are different from the ones that initially make historical periods seem appealing. The real lesson of Viking culture isn't that life was better when it was simpler and more dangerous. It's that humans are remarkably adaptable and can create meaning and community even under incredibly difficult circumstances. This adaptability is something we can apply to modern challenges without recreating historical hardships. The organizational skills that Vikings used to coordinate complex raiding expeditions can be applied to modern projects. The risk assessment abilities they developed for survival can help with modern decision-making. The social bonds they created to survive harsh conditions can inform modern community building. But these applications require understanding how Viking skills and values worked in their original context, not just copying their surface appearances. The goal isn't to become more like Vikings, but to learn from their successes and failures in ways that help us navigate our own challenges more effectively. This approach to historical learning is more difficult than historical fantasy, but it's also more useful. Instead of using history to escape from modern problems, we can use it as a resource for solving them. Instead of romanticizing past societies, we can study them to better understand the possibilities and limitations of human social organization. So the next time you find yourself romanticizing Viking culture, remember that the real Vikings were just people trying to make the best of difficult circumstances with the resources available to them. They made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but often led to consequences they never intended or expected. The most successful Vikings weren't the ones who most perfectly embodied the warrior ideal. They were the ones who recognized when that ideal was becoming obsolete and adapted accordingly. They transitioned from raiding to trading, from fighting to farming, from seeking glory to building sustainable communities. This adaptability, rather than warrior prowess, is probably the most admirable trait of Viking culture. When their traditional way of life stopped working, they didn't cling to it out of stubborn pride. They evolved, changed, and found new ways to thrive in changing circumstances. But that evolution required abandoning many of the romantic elements that make Viking culture appealing to modern people. The successful post-Viking Scandinavians became merchants, diplomats, and administrators, basically the same kinds of people who run modern society. They traded adventure for stability, glory for prosperity, and individual heroics for collective success. Now, you might be wondering what all this means for your own life. The fantasy of becoming a Viking usually reflects some dissatisfaction with modern circumstances, boring jobs, meaningless routines, comfortable but unfulfilling lives. The Viking fantasy offers an escape into a world where individual actions have immediate dramatic consequences and where life has a clear, simple purpose. But here's what really changes everything about how we think about meaning and purpose in life. The things that made Viking life feel meaningful were also the things that made it brutal, short, and often pointless. You can't separate the dramatic consequences from the constant suffering, or the clear purpose from the limited options. Modern life offers something that Viking society never could: the opportunity to create your own meaning and purpose instead of having them imposed by survival necessities. The freedom that modern people complain about, the overwhelming number of choices, the lack of clear direction, the responsibility for defining your own goals, is actually an incredible luxury that most humans throughout history never experienced. Vikings didn't choose to be Vikings because they found raiding spiritually fulfilling. They became raiders because the alternatives were starvation, slavery, or death. Their clear purpose was imposed by circumstances beyond their control, not chosen based on personal values or interests. The modern anxiety about finding purpose and meaning reflects the fact that we actually have the luxury of choosing. This choice is overwhelming and sometimes paralyzing, but it's also an opportunity that represents one of the greatest achievements of human civilization. Instead of fantasizing about times when purpose was imposed by necessity, we can appreciate the freedom to create purpose through choice. Instead of romanticizing societies where individual actions had dramatic consequences because survival was always at stake, we can find ways to make our actions meaningful within systems that provide basic security. The real challenge of modern life isn't that it lacks the drama and clear purpose of historical periods. It's that it offers so many possibilities for drama and purpose that choosing among them becomes a significant challenge in itself. This is a much better problem to have than the problems faced by most people throughout history, even if it doesn't always feel that way. This perspective doesn't solve the modern problems of meaninglessness, isolation, and lack of clear direction. But it does suggest that the solutions lie in making better use of modern opportunities rather than fantasizing about escaping to historical alternatives that were never as appealing as they seem from a distance. You can create adventure in your life without risking death from preventable diseases. You can build meaningful relationships without accepting the social restrictions that historically enforced them. You can find purpose in your actions without limiting yourself to the narrow range of options available to people in survival-focused societies. The key is recognizing that modern freedom comes with modern responsibilities. When your survival isn't dictated by immediate circumstances, you have to take active responsibility for creating the kind of life you want to live. This is harder than following traditional scripts, but it's also more rewarding when done well. Vikings didn't have to worry about finding their passion, or creating work-life balance, or building fulfilling relationships. Their choices were made for them by the harsh realities of medieval Scandinavian life. This simplified decision-making, but it also eliminated most possibilities for personal growth, creative expression, and authentic self-discovery. The modern struggle to create meaning and purpose reflects the fact that we have genuine options. The anxiety that comes with choice is the price of freedom, and it's a price worth paying when we understand what we're getting in return. So what would happen if you actually tried to live like a Viking in the modern world? You'd quickly discover that the elements of Viking life that seem most appealing, the adventure, the clear hierarchy, the simple goals, don't actually work when separated from the survival pressures that created them. Modern Viking lifestyle movements typically focus on the superficial aspects, the aesthetics, the mythology, the romanticized values, but they can't recreate the underlying conditions that made those elements functional in their original context. The result is usually a kind of historical cosplay that misses the point of what made Viking culture work for the people who actually lived it. Real Vikings would probably find modern Viking enthusiasts completely incomprehensible. The idea of choosing to live like a Viking when you could choose to live comfortably and safely would seem like obvious mental illness to people who became Vikings only because they had no better alternatives. This doesn't mean that there's nothing to learn from Viking culture, or that all historical interests are pointless fantasy. But it does mean that the lessons worth learning are different from the ones that initially make historical periods seem appealing. The real lesson of Viking culture isn't that life was better when it was simpler and more dangerous. It's that humans are remarkably adaptable and can create meaning and community even under incredibly difficult circumstances. This adaptability is something we can apply to modern challenges without recreating historical hardships. The organizational skills that Vikings used to coordinate complex raiding expeditions can be applied to modern projects. The risk assessment abilities they developed for survival can help with modern decision-making. The social bonds they created to survive harsh conditions can inform modern community building. But these applications require understanding how Viking skills and values worked in their original context, not just copying their surface appearances. The goal isn't to become more like Vikings, but to learn from their successes and failures in ways that help us navigate our own challenges more effectively. This approach to historical learning is more difficult than historical fantasy, but it's also more useful. Instead of using history to escape from modern problems, we can use it as a resource for solving them. Instead of romanticizing past societies, we can study them to better understand the possibilities and limitations of human social organization. The ultimate irony of the Viking fantasy is that the people most attracted to it usually have the most to lose from actually living like Vikings. Modern people who feel constrained by civilization are typically the ones who benefit most from civilized institutions. The freedom to fantasize about alternative lifestyles is itself a product of the security and prosperity that make those fantasies unnecessary. Real Vikings didn't have the luxury of choosing their lifestyle or fantasizing about alternatives. They lived the way they lived because that's what survival required in their particular time and place. Their culture was a practical response to specific challenges, not a lifestyle choice made from a menu of historical options. Understanding this doesn't make Viking history less interesting, but it does make it more honest. Vikings were people dealing with human problems using the resources available to them. Their solutions were creative and often effective, but they were also limited by circumstances that no longer apply. The modern world presents different challenges that require different solutions. We can learn from historical approaches without trying to recreate historical conditions. We can appreciate past achievements without romanticizing past difficulties. We can find inspiration in human adaptability without fantasizing about living in times when that adaptability was constantly tested by life and death situations. This realistic approach to history is ultimately more empowering than historical fantasy. Instead of using the past as an escape from present responsibilities, we can use it as a tool for meeting those responsibilities more effectively. Instead of wishing we lived in different times, we can focus on making the most of the time we actually have. The Viking Age is over, and that's probably for the best. The conditions that created Viking culture, environmental pressure, political instability, limited economic opportunities, and constant threats to survival, are problems that most modern societies have largely solved. We shouldn't wish for their return just because they produce some interesting historical figures and dramatic stories. The real tribute to Viking adaptability is not trying to recreate their lifestyle, but learning from their example of how to adapt successfully to changing circumstances. They thrived by being realistic about their situation and creative about their responses. We can honor that legacy by being equally realistic about our own situation and equally creative about our own responses. You wouldn't survive as a Viking, but that's not a failure on your part. It's a success on the part of the civilization that produced you. You're adapted for a different kind of life in a different kind of world, and that adaptation represents thousands of years of human progress in creating safer, more prosperous, and more humane ways of organizing society. The challenges you face in modern life are real and significant, but they're the challenges of abundance rather than scarcity, of choice rather than compulsion, of complexity rather than simplicity. These are better problems to have, even when they don't feel that way. The next time you find yourself wishing you could live like a Viking, remember that the real Vikings would probably wish they could live like you. They made the best of difficult circumstances, but they would have jumped at the chance to live in a world where basic security was guaranteed, where individual choices mattered, and where adventure was something you could seek out rather than something that was forced upon you by survival necessity. Your life may not feel as dramatic or meaningful as the Viking life portrayed in popular culture, but it offers possibilities for growth, creativity, and authentic self-expression that were completely unavailable to most people throughout history. The freedom to feel dissatisfied with a comfortable life is itself a remarkable achievement of human civilization. So instead of fantasizing about escaping to a more dramatic historical period, you can focus on creating drama and meaning within the remarkable opportunities that modern life provides. You can build deep relationships, pursue challenging goals, test your limits, and make a meaningful impact on the world, all without the constant threat of death, disease, and starvation that made life dramatic for historical peoples. The Vikings adapted to their circumstances and found ways to thrive within the constraints they faced. You can honor their example by doing the same thing, adapting to your circumstances and finding ways to thrive within the constraints you face. The constraints are different, but the human challenge of creating meaning and purpose within those constraints remains the same. That's the real lesson of Viking history, and it's a lesson that applies to modern life without requiring any fantasy about time travel or lifestyle reenactment. You don't need to become a Viking to live a meaningful life. You just need to bring the same adaptability, creativity, and determination to your own challenges that the Vikings brought to theirs. The age of Viking raids is over, but the age of human adventure is far from finished. There are still new frontiers to explore, still problems to solve, still communities to build, and still ways to test yourself against meaningful challenges. The main difference is that modern adventures don't require risking your life unnecessarily or causing suffering to innocent people. You can pursue excellence, build lasting relationships, create something meaningful, and leave a positive legacy, all while enjoying the benefits of modern medicine, modern safety, and modern opportunities for personal growth. That's not a consolation prize for missing out on Viking life. That's winning the lottery of human history. The Vikings did their best with what they had. You can honor their memory by doing your best with what you have. The tools available to you are different and generally better, but the fundamental human challenge remains the same, making the most of the life you've been given in the time and place where you find yourself. That's a challenge worthy of anyone's best efforts, whether they're facing medieval Scandinavian winters or modern existential anxieties. The Vikings met their version of this challenge with courage, adaptability, and determination. You can meet your version with the same qualities, updated for contemporary circumstances. You wouldn't last a day as a Viking, but the Vikings wouldn't last a day in your life either. That's not because either of you is inadequate. It's because human beings are remarkably good at adapting to their specific circumstances and remarkably poor at adapting to completely foreign ones. Your life is exactly as challenging as it needs to be to bring out your best qualities and create opportunities for growth, meaning, and contribution. The fact that these challenges are different from historical challenges doesn't make them less real or less important. It just makes them yours to face, in your own time and in your own way. The Vikings faced their challenges and earned their place in history. Now it's your turn to face your challenges and earn your place in the ongoing story of human achievement. The stage is different, but the fundamental drama of human life continues, and you have a role to play that's every bit as important as anything the Vikings accomplished. You may not become a legendary warrior, but you can become someone who made the most of the opportunities available to them and left the world a little better than they found it. That's an achievement that would have impressed the Vikings, and it's an achievement that's still available to anyone willing to approach their life with the same seriousness and determination that the Vikings brought to theirs. The Viking age is over, but your age has just begun. Make it count.